And good evening, everyone. Happy Pride. Yes. First of all, welcome to the Library of Congress. And it's very important that I'm very grateful that you're here tonight supporting the Library of Congress during Live at the Library and during World Pride here at the library. So we're so excited. We have a double two authors here tonight. Tonight, we're very excited to welcome the wonderful Thomas Mallon. You know him because of Fellow Travelers, of course, his last novel, Up with the Sun, and of course his new book, juggling all these books, The Very Heart of It. What makes this so exciting for us here at the Library of Congress? What's important to us, that we connect the Library of Congress to everyday people, that you know that the Library of Congress, aside from it being the largest library in the world with more than 181 million items, we're also the nation's library. And it's important to us that Americans see themselves in the library's collection. Of course, we have the papers of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson, but it's important that you see yourselves in the library's collection as well. We have the papers of Frank Kameny and Lily Vincenz and other LGBTQ plus Americans from Howard Ashman to Leonard Bernstein and so much more. But most importantly, we have the papers of Thomas Mallon. And we hope, if you haven't seen it yet, that you go see our display out there within these little rooms. You'll see quilts from the AIDS Quilt Memorial. One of them is a quilt based from Washington, D.C. The other quilt is for New York City. The library is also the home of the AIDS Memorial Quilt Archives. We're very proud of that collection. It has the letters, the photographs, and a lot of memorabilia of the victims of AIDS in the 80s and the 90s, and all the lovely letters from their family. So I'm hoping that you could see that as well. While you're over there, please look at Thomas's diaries and his papers, which includes a draft of some of his books. It's very exciting to see. We nerd out here at the library when it comes to these collection items. And after Thomas tonight, you'll see me again. Please see Jonathan Capehart at 7 o'clock. So I know you're not here to see me tonight, so please welcome Thomas Mallon, joined by the library's literary director, Clay Smith.
Thank you, Roswell. Hi, everybody. So when a person puts together a collection of diaries, they don't just, throw them into print willy-nilly. Were there entries from this period? And by the way, the book covers 1983 to 1994. You still keep a diary, right? So we could have a sequel volume at some point? No.
This?
I think, yeah.
You can hear this?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. I don't think there'll be a sequel to this, but I still, but the library will get the original, so they'll still be around. But I still do. I generally write things up the next morning.
Yeah.
You'll all be in it, and it's really a 50-year-old habit now with some aborted attempts at it earlier. But it really stuck starting in the mid-'70s.
Yeah. Tom is known, of course, as Roswell was saying, for Fellow Travelers, and you've written all these great political novels. In my opinion, there aren't enough novels set in Washington, D.C., or just political novels. It's just such a great world for novelists to depict. But your first book was actually about writers' diaries, a book of one's own from 1983, I think. How did studying the diaries of other writers influence your own diary writing? Did it make you more self-conscious in the diary writing process? Or?
A little bit. I think that I became interested in diaries because I used them. I was a scholar. I was a regular English literature PhD, and I used them in the course of, analyzing works, seeking biographical information, and so forth. And before the book you mentioned, which was really the first trade book I wrote a little kind of academic monograph, which was a book-long production that was based on my dissertation, which was about the English First World War poet Edmund Blunden, and I remember using his diaries. He was a wonderful dissertation subject because he had absolutely beautiful, legible handwriting, which made it easy. But his papers, unsurprisingly, were in Austin, Texas, at the Humanities Research Center, with much of English literature from that period. And I wanted to see the diary he had kept on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. It was illegal for soldiers to keep diaries because if they got captured, the diaries could presumably tell the enemy something. But Blunden did keep a diary, even though he had a very non-rebellious nature. And the archivist brought that diary and some other materials out to me, and I opened up the diary to the summer of 1916, and the first thing that happened was some dried wildflowers that he had picked up on the battlefield fell out of it. And nothing evoked him and that period, that time, as that did. And, but the power of, the immediacy of diaries interested me a lot. And because they're books that are ostensibly private, although when I wrote the book you referred to, A Book of One's Own, I said nobody ever kept a diary just for himself. You sort of imagine somewhere down the road there's an audience, even if it's one person, a grandchild finding it in an attic. So I became so interested in them as a form and as a practitioner of the form that's what led to that book.
Yeah. But also, I mean, yeah, we are now going to read your diaries, but you're rereading yourself when you came here to the library or at home to go through all of these many books of diaries that you have. Is the person who was writing these diaries from 1983 to 94, does that feel like a different person to you, or?
I wish he felt more different. To me, I can see all of the embarrassing things, the fretfulness, the amount of time he spends worrying about the things that are not consequential, his terrible judgment of human character. Certainly in the early stages of getting to know somebody, there are, I thought that's not that person, you know? I mean, you're probably not keeping a very realistic, honest diary if rereading it doesn't make you wince. And when I say rereading it, I really should say reading it, because I didn't read the vast majority of this material until the last few years. When I was getting ready to organize my papers, and my papers were coming to the library, the appraiser of the papers wanted some transcript, and that was when I just said, I'll look at the 80s, because it was so far back. And I discovered this sort of manic quality to the entries. One day, I'm really happy. Some romantic aspiration, some career advancement. I'm getting a little traction as a writer. And the next day, I would crash back to earth because a friend was sick, or there had been one of these horrible apocalyptic articles in the newspaper projecting numbers of deaths and so forth. And I don't think I'm normally a manic person. I mean, I'm a person of moods like anybody else, but I was struck by the altitude of the sine curve in this period, and
vicissitudes.
And that's when I decided I would approach my editors at the New Yorker and say, "Do you want a piece of this?"
Mm-hmm. So I think one, you know, certainly we see the 80s and in the context of the HIV and AIDS crisis depicted in film and in novels. You know, The Great Believer by Rebecca Makkai, for example, is widely read. But it is difficult, I think, for those of us who were maybe too young in the 80s to really feel what it was like to live through that era. And you were in New York City, the epicenter of so much of it. And one of the great things about this book is that there's just an emotional immediacy to it. And so I wondered if we could, I don't know if you want to read it or if you want me to read it. There's an entry from 1990, which is, you know, 6-7 years into the crisis. from October 27th, where it's about one of the drug therapies, and it's an indication that even in 1990, when the drugs had come along, no one felt really emotionally sure that they would work. And this passage sort of shows the complexity of that whole moment.
Have we got the right page?
It's October 27th.
Oh, I'm sorry, October 27.
Starts with Billy.
Yes. There we are. Sorry. This is March 28.
Yep.
Billy will start AZT next week, which was an early drug therapy. His count has gone down, and the doctor says it's time. We say we are not scared, and I think we mean it. We were ready for this 6 months ago. We'd already crossed the bridge in our minds, but now we're going over it on foot, and at first it won't be easy. We tell ourselves all the useful things. Thank God for the medicine. How different things are in 1990 from the way they were in '84. How we know people who've been on it and healthy for years, that it buys time until the breakthroughs which are coming get here. How it's no different from insulin or blood pressure pills. But it is, of course.
So there's, 6 years into keeping, or at least the diaries in this collection, there's this ruefulness, and it doesn't seem like you feel defeated in that passage, but you're certainly not. I don't think hopeful would be the right word.
No, I wouldn't allow myself hopefulness, and yet my life and my partner's life turned out to be very lucky. But we knew too many people whose lives were not lucky or did not turn out that way to have that much hope. But there were, it's very difficult to grasp how, I think one of the things you're talking about here is how people sort of think, well, there was AIDS and then this semi-cure came in, the cocktail came in. The cocktail came in 6 years after that passage, and there was a long, long period where, in some cases, the medicine did less good for people, did more harm than good to people. So you were waiting and waiting and waiting for these advances. I just read in the paper today in The Guardian that Australian doctors have been developing a technique by which they can find HIV, which sort of hides in white blood cells, and if they can bring it out of hiding, they can attack it directly. So there may finally be what people were looking for forever, which was a cure, not just a suppressant drug. I mean, the suppressant drugs were wonderful. They kept millions of people alive. And so we might be on the threshold of that. I wish that American science would be part of that, and that American science would be fully funded to do those things.
There are characters in a collection of nonfiction like this, in a collection of diary entries, just in the exact same way that we speak of characters in a novel. And Tom Curley was, I think, one of your early loves, and fills about the first 100 or more pages of this book. Tell us a little bit about him and your relationship with him.
Well, the relationship was relatively brief and stormy. He was a spectacularly handsome young man. He was a PhD in classics, and when I knew him, he was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. And Tom got sick really still pretty early on in the epidemic, and was very sick by the summer of 1984. And he was hospitalized that summer, and he died in October of that year. And so I was at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital about every other day, became very firmly bonded with his mother, who remained a close friend of mine until she died in her early 90s, around 2015. And I recount the hospital ordeal where Tom, he was losing his mind, not to put too fine a point on it, in addition to all the physical afflictions that he had. And I'm recording this terrible decline. And one of the things that sort of I feel queasy about in this book, there's a reason the book starts where it does, but the reader doesn't really see Tom Curley, the Tom Curley that was. This, he was so handsome, I used to think, what does he want with me? Even, you know, and you don't see how accomplished he was, and you don't see all of those things because once the disease was upon you, that was what you became. And, you know, I did my level best because I think I had some sense at the time that it was important to record the physical manifestations of it, the emotional manifestations of it. There are a lot of pictures in the book, and the last picture in the book is of me with my partner of, I better get it right, 36 years. 36 years. Who is Billy, and that, and who, as he now tells friends, oh yes, I come in on page 297 in 1989, and it's a picture of Bill and I and Louise Curley, Tom's mother, from 2007, and we're at Thanksgiving dinner because we had Thanksgiving dinner with Louise for years and years and years. So that struggle, sickness and death, it bonded a lot of people together unexpectedly and permanently.
Mm-hmm. Sort of, not exactly the same, but like military, members of the military who refer to themselves as brothers. You've been kind of through a war or a battle together. And by the way, Tom Curley and I think Louise are in the collections display that our librarians very thoughtfully put together. I mean, as I sort of mentioned, one of the things about reading this book, especially in the early part where HIV and AIDS are really coming on strong, is that you didn't know what was going on. You had a doctor who was supportive, but he didn't know what was going on. And you know, as sort of safe as you tried to be, you have a passage where you met a dashing German man once, and you write, you know, you were really attracted to him, and you write, perhaps I'm finally determined to have what others always thought was a good time now that we're in the last days of Pompeii. And so this sense of fatalism that, you know, an epidemic brings on, that you don't know if you're going to make it through, so why don't you just at least have fun? That is such a complex emotion. And in any other time, we might say that it's unsafe, but you were living through the early onset of AIDS, right?
Well, one of the things that was lucky for me, I mean, I was, it's an understatement to say I was a late bloomer romantically and sexually, that by that time one knew at least how to protect oneself to a degree. Nothing was foolproof. So, you know, you felt it could give yourself permission in a way. I mean, even in the blurb, Paul Rudnick, who's a wonderful writer, gave the book a lovely blurb, and he referred to my hectic love life in the 80s, which didn't feel that hectic at the time, but I suppose it was. But you didn't know what would happen. And one of the narrative lines in the book, I mean, all diaries have these narrative lines, like novels, that you can extract from them. And one of them in this book is the question of whether to be tested or not to be tested. For a while, there was no test. Then there was a test, but people who had real credibility, even Larry Kramer, who became such a ferocious activist, was telling people as late as 1987, don't take the test. what's the point of it? There's nothing they're going to be able to do for you except maybe semi-poison you with AZT if you test positive. And he said, why live with a sword of Damocles hanging over your head? That argument became less persuasive several years later when therapies were improving and you thought you should know your status so that you can buy yourself time, perhaps. And that was true for many people who lived up to what they called the cocktail. I did not get an AIDS test until 1990, and I was negative. And but I spent 6 years from the time of Tom Curley, to that date, worrying and making contingency plans. I'm a highly neurotically organized person, and I was writing a book about plagiarism, and this book was like Vietnam. It just went on and on and on, and I was not very happy. And I wanted to write a second novel. And there's one night where I actually sort of mentally, it's in that I make a list of pros and cons. I can't start this novel, even though I'm really fired up about the idea of it, until I finish the plagiarism book, because if I turn out to have it, I'll probably have 2 years. And if I have the 2 years, I'll probably die and have half of the plagiarism book and half of this novel, which is really no good. So I have to keep going. At least I'll have the goddamn plagiarism book, And but you made decisions that way, and you thought that way.
Well, it's also so interesting. I mean, I think of you as a writer who publishes, relatively frequently. I feel like you're gifted in that way. I feel like I turn around and there's always something new from you, which is really great and rare. And a critic for the New Yorker, and you're so practiced. And in the early pages of this book, you're so excited at walking past a bookstore window and seeing your first trade book in the window, or is it face out, or is it you're comparing it yourself to the other writers, and so life goes on during an epidemic. And that was a beautiful thing to see also.
My editor, Edward Kastemeyer, was really wonderful to me with this book. He became my editor after Dan Frank was my editor for 25 years and so many books. And Edward took over from him when Dan died a few years ago. And I made an argument to Edward. I said, I know you want a book that's capped at 150,000 words. That's what the contract, in fact, called for. I said, the book has got to be longer than that because, for one thing, as a student of diaries, as somebody who wrote that book about diaries, I can tell you that 500 pages of diaries read faster than a 500-page novel, just the segmentation. But I said the main reason why I wanted what turned out to be about 60,000 more words, I said, is I have to show you there has to be a lot about literary life in there. There has to be a lot about political life in there. There has to be all of this thing, because the point was we kept on living. There was no alternative to that. And I remember back in college, I had Professor Charles Nichols at Brown. Was an African-American professor, and I took his course on the 20th century novel, and we read The Sound and the Fury, and I believe the last line in The Sound and Fury is about Dilsey, the black woman, and the last words of the book meaning about African Americans who had grown up in that part of the country in those days. Faulkner writes, they endured. And I remember Charles Nichols sort of looking up from the lectern, looking at us and saying, what the hell else were they supposed to do? And he had credibility to say that. He knew what he was talking about. And I think I felt that too, that there was no other alternative. And I have many wonderful memories of the 80s.
Yeah.
What was not to like? I was young, I was in my 30s. There were good things too.
Yeah. It's interesting to see you, you wrote a novel about Reagan, and to see you kind of prevaricating through the different months and days of 1984. as the presidential election came up, about what you thought about him. And then, years later, you're writing a novel about him. So it's great to see a writer's, preoccupations early on.
I mean, I was always maddeningly conservative to most of my friends, and I admired what Reagan was doing in foreign policy. I thought the Evil Empire speech was one of the great speeches of my life. Finally, somebody said it. And I had thought that the Democratic Party had walked away from the Cold War, and I was very much in favor of that. And yet there is a passage in 1984, I go into the voting booth, and I cannot bring myself to vote for him because of the moral majority and social issues and his terrible inattention to AIDS, which will be a blot on his record. But there was also a great consequentiality and importance to other things he was doing. And politically, I've always sort of lived my life between two fires, and I don't think it was. I don't think it was the worst thing for me. It was kind of bracing, and but I was never comfortably politically. I can tell you, looking back on this, rereading this and going through this era, and Ronald Reagan, Ed Koch in New York, Margaret Thatcher in Brooklyn, Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia. These were consequential people who believed what they said. And I never, it's hard to say this, but I never thought I would long for the 80s politically. But I do long for the 80s politically because there was an honesty to the battles, there were high stakes to them, and we were being governed by people who had some business holding the office that they held.
For me, as just doing what I do and being a book journalist and book critic, the literary culture in the 1980s depicted in this book and the way that it is depicted versus the American literary culture now. There have been articles about this. The literary culture in America now is often portrayed as being very nice. And maybe one of the reasons for that is understandable, because on social media you can kind of ruin or at least damage someone's career pretty quickly. And writers talk about how hard it is to get a book deal now. I mean, I know that they talked about that in the 80s too. But you are pretty honest in these pages, and you admit to that in your preface. And Mary McCarthy, who famously got into a number of literary squabbles in her time, was a mentor of yours. And there is someone you refer to him, you write about him. His life is one long glide across a ballroom floor. He never misses a step, and he'll never leave a footprint. That is kind of a brilliant dig. Talk to me about, literary culture in the time that you're depicting in this book versus now. Do you have thoughts about that?
It was much more rough and tumble. First of all, there was much more of it. The magazine culture was very healthy, vibrant, awash in money, as opposed to now. Newspapers were everywhere. Newspapers drove the sales of literary fiction, newspaper reviewing. And now, you're down to a handful of reviews that matter much. And there was not yet what came to be in our day called cancel culture. If somebody went after you, or if you went after somebody, and when Clay says honest, he's being polite. What he really means is mean. There's a lot of mean commentary in these diaries, but you lived to fight another day. You didn't disappear. You weren't pushed beyond the pale. People didn't say no one should ever publish this person again. No one should ever listen to this person again. But the economics of the literary business were much better, much healthier than they are today. I mean, we are now, really 30 years into the internet, and publishing is still not quite figured out how it's going to remain publishing. And that is a big question. And the literary life that's depicted in this book in the 1980s really, I think, resembles literary life more from the 1920s than it resembles literary life from the 2020s.
Yeah.
You know? And as far as AI is concerned, I'm just at that stage now where thank God I'm old.
So last question for me, and then we've got some volunteers who are going to bring some mics around. And so if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll try to get all the questions answered. In the Showtime adaptation of Fellow Travelers, were you very much involved in that? Or are you a writer who kind of thinks, okay, I wrote my version, and someone else can take that and be creative, or did you want to get involved?
I stayed out of their hair entirely because I know nothing about screenwriting. There's also an opera from Fellow Travelers, which I stayed out of their hair because I know nothing about that. I liked the show that they did. It was very faithful to the spirit of the book, even as it extrapolated the characters and took them into other decades. I met everybody after it was over. I had an email from Matt Bomer last week. Thank you very much. And it was a good experience, and the book sold more in the months after that program was on than it had sold for sure between 2007 and 2023. It was interesting to me. David Remnick had me on the New Yorker radio program, and he said, well, how do you really feel about adaptation? And I had to say, most of my fiction has been historical in nature. And so in a sense, I'm an adapter. I play with history. I insert things into history that didn't actually happen and so forth. So I really, even if they had done a bad job, which they didn't, but even if they had, I think it's sort of difficult for me, who is an adapter from the start, to object to somebody else doing it.
Yeah, no, that's a healthy attitude. Okay, what questions do you all have? Tom had a lot of different other dates in the book, so you might want to ask about any of his other dates. No. Okay.
Hello? Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you so much for speaking. This has been so interesting. I was just wondering if you ever let people read your diaries as you were writing them, pre-publication in the 80s and until now, essentially.
Did everybody hear that? Okay. No. Okay, she was asking if Tom ever let anybody read his diaries as he was writing them.
No. Never. And one of the things I did was when my papers were getting ready to come to the library during the pandemic, I knew that I was doing this thing for the New Yorker, and I knew that I probably wanted to get a book out of this, and I realized, well, I can't go to Capitol Hill every day to read my own diaries. It's the same. So I had scanned my photographs too, because the library is a completist. They want everything: manuscripts, photographs, correspondence, whatever. And I thought, so we've got to scan all these diaries, and there were nearly 150 of them. And so Bill and I, my partner and I, we each scanned a diary a day, flatbed scanning on top, so that I would have these PDFs to work with. And I remember when we were doing this, I said, to Bill, you can't read anything after 1989, because you're likely in it. But no, I think, you'd become mortally self-conscious if you did that.
Who else? Any other questions on this side? Okay, one right here.
Looking back at all of the people who passed away in the 80s and mid 90s, it's striking how many talented people we lost, and it's sort of staggering, I think, for me when I think about all the art and culture that we missed out on from not having these people. I wonder, when you were writing your diaries, I think you mentioned earlier that you were thinking, about a future audience. Did you ever wonder who the readers might be 20, 30, 40 years from when you were writing, and sort of wondering if they could imagine the sort of gravity of what was going on at the time?
Did I wonder who might be reading these books? Yeah.
What might they be thinking?
Yeah. I wouldn't say I thought too much about that because I think that would be inhibiting in a way. But I always, as I said about that book about diaries, A Book of One's Own, I always felt that there was some reader that one had in mind, meaning the existence of a reader you had in mind. I didn't know who it was, but I often addressed the diary. I'll often use the second person, sort of like, you won't believe this. Who is you? It's you as anybody who's reading the diary. But it's almost like when you think of the classic model. Adolescence. In my era growing up, boys didn't keep diaries, but girls frequently kept diaries, and they animated the diaries. Dear Diary. It was a thing like Anne Frank's diary, Dear Kitty. I did very hesitant. I did very faintly sometimes think that it was important for me to put something down that would preserve some of the texture of life, what that was like, even if it was a very incidental thing. That told you what it was like to live medically, romantically, and all of the things in those days. And I tried to allow myself, hope in those days. And hope was in very short supply. And if I can say the last semi-inflammatory thing that I'm thinking, I would say if we talked the other day on the phone about books to read, from this time, and I was thinking of Paul Manette's memoirs. Edmund White just passed away. Edmund White wrote a great deal about his life before and during AIDS. There are many novels and works of nonfiction. Randy Schilt's book, And the Band Played On, which was about the early days of the epidemic in San Francisco. But I would also say one book to recommend is On Call, the memoirs of Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, who to me is one of the most disgracefully maligned public servants that we've ever had. You can argue about COVID policy till the cows come home, but Anthony Fauci was one of the people who, to use a Jesse Jackson phrase from the 80s, kept hope alive. And he listened to people. He listened to people who were sick. He allowed people to yell at him. He allowed people to give him ideas that, might pay off or might not. And there were lots of people not working at that level, but there were people that you learned the people you could count on back then. You learned who your friends were.
Yeah. Well, and mentioning Edmund White, and let's remember him. What we now call autofiction, thinly veiled fiction that is to some degree about the writer's own life. That's very much an Edmund White mode. But the diary is much better for you, even when you're writing in the second person. You're not really an autofiction kind of.
I think this is to me, this is a very important point. In that one of the reasons this book was, I still don't quite believe that that I'm publishing this book, because it's highly personal. There are moments that are intense. There are moments that's so embarrassing to me. But it's true that my fiction has not been about my life. I've written very little about my life. My fiction's been set generally in the past. It's been set in political worlds. If I had anything to do with them, it was very peripherally, And I was not used to publishing anything much about myself, even though every day I was writing very personally about myself in these diaries. So this is sort of a joining of those two lives.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've got time for one more question. Okay. Let's go back here. And then if you didn't get your question asked, I do want to remind you that Tom is going to be signing in just at the end of this beautiful hallway that is decorated with the 9 muses, by the way, on the ceiling. So just encourage you to join Tom at his signing, and we've got a few minutes left of the collections display where you can see his diaries and what we've been talking about. So yes.
Tom, now that you have bared your soul and can't wait to read it, what would you like to write next?
I'm going back into the past. I'm working on a novel called The Late Unpleasantness, which is set during the Civil War. That was an old Southern euphemism for the Civil War. Oh yes, the late unpleasantness. People used to say in the late 19th century. And I feel very much safer and calmer, doing research. As always, the Library of Congress is indispensable to me. What used to be called the National Digital Newspaper Program, which became Chronicling America. I can sit in my sweatpants at my computer terminal at home and access all of these newspapers from every part of the country from back then. And I'm still doing my writing every so often for the New Yorker and places like that. But the library's been indispensable to me, and I just want to say I do the little exhibit of the things from the collection really staggered me when I saw it, and it really brought home to me the first time, not for the first time, but really in a very deep, essential way, that it is the honor of my life to have my papers here at this institution, which belongs to the American people and belongs to the legislative co-equal branch of government, the United States Congress. And thank you for having me for all eternity.
Well, we're honored to, and let's thank Tom for being here.